we've heard a lot from the left they've been crying for a messiah ever since Donald Trump won, because they basically blamed Donald Trump's victory in 2024 on Joe Rogan's existence, because they saw Donald Trump, they saw other right-wing figures like Vivek Ramaswamy and JD Vance go on these podcasts with massive viewership and extremely positive reception, right? And, Kamala Harris, she kind of sort of did a media tour on podcasts as well, but it wasn't that great. It was very limited. People didn't really respond to that all too well. And so a lot of people looked at that and they were like, oh, this is the podcast election. The winners all went on podcasts and the losers didn't do that well on the podcast if they didn't go on at all. What the left needs is thought leaders in the podcast space to sort of rival those of Joe Rogan, and in the way that Joe Rogan and Tim Pool and other podcasters are shaping the right-wing mind. We need left-wingers to have podcasts who similarly shape left-wingers' minds. Now, I will say that there have been left-wing podcasts for a long time. Also, cable news shows have been, many of them have been in podcast form for a long time. But generally speaking, outside of like New York Times podcasts and like Pod Save America in extremely urban areas that are densely populated with yuppies and college graduates, you don't really see left-wing podcasts sort of, get a lot of attention or get very popular among, young adults. Now, I will say, though, that, if the left is going to have a Joe Rogan, the interesting thing about Joe Rogan is, you might not know this. Many people might not acknowledge this, but Joe Rogan is not primarily political. Why he has been so effective in shaping public opinion is he is just he's just a guy who finds certain things interesting. He likes cracking jokes. He loves the comedy scene, so he interviews a lot of comedians. He interviews famous people, right? Like Rob Lowe was on the Joe Rogan Experience. Is Rob Lowe necessarily political? No, he's not. That dude's an actor. He's had I think recently, he had like who's the guy who makes all those bloody gory films? Quentin Tarantino. He had Quentin Tarantino on the podcast. He's not political, and I don't think they talk about politics at all during that episode. If the left is going to look for someone who's going to replace Joe Rogan, they need to stop looking at these people who are so ideological. Looking at Pod Save America, look at Hassan Piker, looking at Dean Withers, looking at who was that guy who was paid by the DNC? Harry Sisson. Looking for all these people who are purely political to be their champions and push their ideas into the forefront of the American mind. They're not going to do it if someone is standing there with a vote blue no matter who sticker on their chest, right? Extremely ideological, leading with the politics. They need someone who is fun. They need someone who is jovial. They need someone who is easy to get along with and doesn't take things super seriously all the time. Someone who's willing to speak to people from all different walks of life, and is just not as negative or not as puritanical as a lot of left-wing political commentators tend to be. And so if there's ever going to be a left-wing Joe Rogan, I think he's actually rising to prominence right now. We see his growth happening right now. He is sparking political conversations right now. And his name is Stephen A. Smith. Stephen A. Smith. This is a guy who has been a hallmark of the sports world for decades, right? I want to say decades. He has his own podcast now called the Stephen A. Smith Show. That show has taken many iterations over the past several years. It's been an ESPN radio show that was canceled and then brought back and then canceled again. Now he has his own podcast called the Stephen A. Smith Show. And in that podcast, he mostly talks about sports because he is a sports guy. And sports is a very, very major pillar of American culture and American society. Kind of similar to how Joe Rogan, he mostly was like in like the sports world of the UFC as well as comedy. Stephen A. Smith has penetrated American culture and society by being a big figure in the sports world. But Stephen A. Smith talks about politics here and there. And as political things heat up, just like Joe Rogan, he talks about politics more. And then when things simmer down, just like Joe Rogan, he sticks to the sports. He sticks to the things that got him the most popular. So that's the blueprint that you would need to follow if you're going to replace Joe Rogan. Generally, the Joe Rogan replacement is probably not going to be done on purpose. Stephen A. Smith is not trying to be the next Joe Rogan. That's not what he's trying to do. And he's not around trying to push left-wing talking points. Similar to how like Joe Rogan doesn't necessarily try to push any political talking points to the left or the right. So watch out for Stephen A. Smith, especially if you're on the right, because that guy is going to end up being the left-wing equivalent to Joe Rogan if his trajectory remains the same and if no one else comes up doing something similar. I find this very interesting. I also find it interesting that not many people are pointing out, hey, maybe Stephen A. Smith is going to be the next Joe Rogan, but for the left. So that's my thought. If you guys have any thoughts on who else might be the left-wing's answer to Joe Rogan, who's not Stephen A. Smith, I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are. I could be a little bit, oblivious. That might be a blind spot to me because I am on the right wing. Despite being an aspiring enlightened centrist, I am still a right winger. So, maybe there's some people I'm just not aware of, but it seems to me that Stephen A. Smith is the only hope that the left wing has of having a replacement for Joe Rogan.